For more than 60 years, the US has been involved in conflicts all over the world. But what if there's a pattern to it all? A pattern that's predictable, really expensive, and maybe not getting the job done. Today, we're going to dig into that history to really understand a huge foreign policy decision that's being made as we speak. And that brings us to the big question right up front. Is the US walking into another endless war? It's not just a hypothetical either. A recent move by the US government has a lot of people worried that we're about to repeat a long, costly, and maybe unwinnable foreign entanglement. So what was that move? Well, it was the 2025 decision to label the Balochistan Liberation Army, or the BLA, as a restricted group. Now, the BLA is a nationalist movement in Pakistan that's been around for a long, long time. By making this move, the U.S. is essentially siding with Pakistan's security forces. But to get what that really means, we have to look back at the history. And believe me, this history goes deep. The BLA isn't some new group that just popped up. Nope. It's the modern face of a conflict that has been going on for 77 years. So for the U.S. to jump in now, well, it brings up some very familiar and very tough questions. The resilience of this movement is just wow. For 77 years, it's pushed back against Pakistani control. It targets huge, important projects like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And get this, even a superpower like China hasn't been able to stop the BLA or protect its own huge investments in the area. That's the incredibly complex and volatile situation the U.S. is now officially stepping into. But this thing in Balochistan, it's not happening in a vacuum. Not at all. It fits right into a much, much bigger story of American intervention over the past 60 years. And it's a story that has a pretty clear pattern of, let's just say, unsatisfactory results. Let's just start with the sheer time commitment. First, you have the Vietnam War. Then, decades later, the war in Afghanistan. The similarity is kind of shocking. Both were 20-year conflicts. 20 years. That's an entire generation spent fighting, only to end with a withdrawal, not a victory. And then there's Iraq. It's almost the same script. The objective in 2003 seemed simple enough. Get rid of a dictator, build a stable democracy. But the outcome when the U.S. left in 2011, the exact opposite. The country was a mess. Totally unstable, creating a vacuum that let a group like ISIS rise and take over. The gap between what was intended and what actually happened was massive. And we saw it happen again in Libya in 2011. The military goal, getting rid of Muammar Gaddafi, was done pretty quickly with NATO airstrikes. But our sources point out a critical mistake. There was no plan for what came next. The result wasn't a stable new country. It was a collapsed state, years of total chaos, and a brutal civil war that's still going on. Okay, so these aren't just a few bad one-offs. When you actually line them up side by side, the data from decades of U.S. foreign policy tells a really powerful and, frankly, sobering story about the real limits of military power. I mean, the data here is just stark. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. Just read down that outcome column. The story is stunningly consistent. Withdrawal, instability, the enemy regaining power, prolonged chaos. It almost didn't matter if it was a 20-year war or a quick bombing campaign. The result was pretty much never the stable, positive outcome that was the original goal. All right, now we need to add another really critical layer to this whole story. This pattern of intervention isn't just a foreign policy problem anymore. It's crashing head-on into a massive crisis that's happening right here at home. This number, it basically says it all. $37 trillion. That's the U.S. national debt. It's the highest it has ever been in American history. The interest payments alone are on track to become one of the biggest expenses in the entire federal budget. It's just staggering. And a debt that massive forces us to ask a really tough question. One that connects all these foreign wars with the economic reality at home. It's this. Should a nation this deeply indebted continue to police the world, or should it first restore its own fiscal health? So when you put these two giant issues together, you see the real challenge. On one side, you have a history of being stretched thin in conflicts all over the globe. On the other, you have this mind-boggling level of debt. Our sources are basically saying this combination is uniquely dangerous. So here's the bottom line, the core dilemma the U.S. is facing. We know from history that our military often struggles against local, dug-in movements. We've seen that even small interventions can backfire and make things more unstable. We know these conflicts cost billions, all while that national debt just keeps climbing. And now the designation of the BLA looks like it might be starting that exact same cycle all over again, at a time when we can least afford it. Which leaves us with one last pretty provocative question to think about. Is the United States caught in a dangerous loop, overstretched in other countries and getting weaker financially at home? Is this a combination that 60 years of history tells us is ultimately just unsustainable?